Alright, so in our continuing series of Ani Ladodi Badodi Li, we're still in the Rebbe's Mimer from Tafshin Lamed Beis, 272, where we're explaining, we're explaining a few different questions. The question we began with was, we wound up saying that according to the Tzemach Tzedek, the distinction between blowing the shofar in Elul and Rosh Hashanah was twofold. What's the difference between the shofar of Elul and the shofar of Rosh Hashanah? We said the shofar of Elul represents the lower fear, the shofar of Rosh Hashanah represents the higher fear. And why do we blow the shofar in Elul? Because in order to come to the higher level of fear, you must first go through the lower level of fear, and therefore it comes first. The second reason we said was that on the time that basically, when it comes to the 10 days of tshuva, we're at this tremendous level of repairing all the things that we damaged during the year, and we draw down a makif light. It's actually today's Tanya. It talks about giving tzedakah. It says that all the mitzvahs, in today's Tanya says it's very relevant to this. It says all the mitzvahs are limited, right? The tzitzis is such and such, 12 dalim is a measure. The tefillin has to be square and black. Even the karbanos, right, they have to be a certain year and they bring them in a certain time and so forth. He says, but tzedakah, even though tzedakah, it says he also, someone who gives more than a fifth is doing something wrong. However, that's if everything goes well. But you can give much more than that. Just like a person who would pay a doctor, he would pay out every single thing he had in the bank. So it's not different. You're the soul doctor. In other words, you give tzedakah like ein sof, and this notion of giving something way beyond like measure draws down a life from Hashem, which fills in which has the ability to like heal and fill in all the things that are missing. So this too is like basically this idea of what makes a person give so much and like lose himself is a humility and a bittul and a self-nullity. So we said that in order to draw down this makif light, which is able to fill in all of the lackings for the whole year, you need to draw down a tremendous level of bittul. It says, which house will you build for me? House, we said before, representing makif. How can you hold Hashem in a house? How can you bear inside the world this level of the house, which is the makif, by humility? So we said, the Tzemach Tzedek says, therefore we blow the shofar in Elul to arouse like a bittul and a fear. But the question was, what? Who remembers the question? Good.
So why do we blow in the why do we blow in the month of Elul? Because we blow anyway in Rosh Hashanah, and in Rosh Hashanah it's like a higher thing.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said it better. We already have a nice shofar in Rosh Hashanah. On the contrary, we just got through saying Rosh Hashanah represents a higher fear and more bittul. So it's not really something is missing, it sounds like. But Tzemach Tzedek says that we need the shofar of Elul for that. Seemingly the shofar of Rosh Hashanah should do it, and it should do it better. Okay, so that was a question in Os Daled. We covered a little ground here. So going on to Os Gimel. Os Daled discusses a notion, is the difference basically between the lower and the higher fear. And it says that in the whole mashal, the king is in the field. Basically, this representation of the king in two different places represents a different aspect of godliness that is available to us depending on the month, depending on our level of service. So when the king is in the field, it means he's not in his place of his palace, which means he is sort of with the people, which means godliness descends, contracts itself, and it represents that aspect of godliness which Hashem himself sets aside for the sake of the world. So it's not like really the infinite Orein Sof light, which is totally beyond creation, right? That is represented by the king in his palace. The idea of the king in his palace is that he's removed from the people, which means he's removed from creation, that in this level of light, creation hasn't happened or hasn't even been thought of yet, right? So when Hashem comes into the field, it represents like the little aspect of godliness that he siphoned off from the Orein Sof with which to create the world. So the idea is that is why we can only reach the lower level of fear in Elul, because an aspect of godliness which is diminished in order to create us, we can never sort of lose our sense of self in light of such a level of godliness. Why? Because that level of godliness intrinsically recognizes us. It's actually been siphoned off to create us. So it's not enough godliness, so to speak, to like nullify us completely out of the picture. Because on the contrary, in the realm of this godliness, it's there to support our existence and to bring our existence into being. So even when we meditate upon it, and we become nullified to it, and we have fear of God because of it, the fear is a lower level of fear, and the nullity is a lower level of nullity, which is called a bittul hayesh, nullity of your own desires, which means if you concentrate on godliness, you will remove your desires from worldliness and put them into godliness, but there'll still be you desiring those things. There's still a self. Whereas the higher level of fear, you can't get it on your own. It comes from above, from a gift from above, because the whole notion is that if it's coming from your own, then it's limited into your limited understanding and your limited creation. So you can't get out of it. You can't lose yourself. When Hashem draws a line down from the Makif light, from like the place of the godliness, which is identified as the king in his palace, which is totally removed from the world, then if you should be able to get your hands on this light, and you can't get it on your own, Hashem has to give it to you, then you can go to a state of yira ilah, a higher level of fear, which is also called bittul b'metzius. So the level of self-nullity which comes along with this is called a total self-nullity, right? Which means you actually cease to experience yourself at all. You're like a channel of godliness, like Moshe Rabbeinu, like tzaddikim. They don't have a sense of I, or rather their sense of I is God himself, which means that they've gone to this level of higher bittul. Now, okay, that being said, we're saying we had another question, a small question, which we also settled in the end of Oz Daled. So we said this is essentially the difference between Elul and Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is like it's like it comes from above because Hashem is in the palace, and the whole scene of the king in the palace is like something that happens to you from above. It's not like a Hamish thing, the king's in the field. You're experiencing like something which is incredible, watching this man who like controls the whole world. That's like a revelation from above, and therefore it's like it comes to you from above. Yeah.
When Moshe and Hashem are arguing and saying, I'm going to destroy this people, I'm making to a great nation, and
right.
Moshe responds back and says, if you do that, write me out of your book, and take me out of your book. Like you're saying, like it's completely fiddle to God, but then they have these arguments about foolish, and they take me out. Take me out of this book. I want nothing to do with it.
It's true, but how do we explain that? That it looks like tzaddikim. So basically, it says that it's another aspect of God himself. In other words, when you talk about God, right? Hashem in the Torah, he's a character in the Torah, right? Interestingly enough, like there's like Avram, and then there's Lot, and then there's God. You know what I mean? He's another character. You know what I'm saying? So that's strange a little bit, right? Because we know that God is everything. So what it comes out to is that the characters which are not God represent the sense of God, the godliness as he presents himself into limited form. For example, that's why Avram represents Chesed, and Yitzchak represents Gevura, and Yaakov represents Tiferes. Moshe also has a Sphira. Moshe's Sphira is a little bit more complicated, depending on the Maimon, a different Sphira. But nonetheless, he represents a limited aspect of godliness which is inside the world. Okay? Therefore, what you're really experiencing there, so to speak, is like a machloikis between like Soviv Kolomim and Mamalik Kolomim. It's not that it's not all God. It's just that there's two. It says Kel Deos Havaya. There's two opinions, so to speak, within godliness. There's what's called Das Elyon and Das Tachton, because there's a reality that's also taking place inside the Tzimtzum, right? But it's a different reality that Hashem bears from beyond before the Tzimtzum, where there's like no worlds. So in other words, when godliness comes into the creation, it's God himself, but it's like God himself within a different perception. It says Moshe Rabbeinu is called Ish HaElokim. It says half man, half God, half Ish, half Elokim. It means to say that like what Moshe basically represents. If you understand, Moshe is not really a person. None of these people are like really people. They are people. I'm not saying they're not people, but they're revelations is what they are basically. And what they are is like a certain revelation within the world of God himself. It says Mechon Shivtecha Yishgiach. There's a pasuk about it in the Tefillah Moshe. No, it's not Tefillah Moshe. It's in the Perik Lamed Beis, I think, or Lamed Hey, Lamed Daled, or Lamed Gimel. One of those two. But it says Mechon Shivtecha Yishgiach. Mechon Shivtecha Yishgiach is Rosh Tevis Moshe. Mechon Shivtecha Yishgiach, which, and the words mean the place of his like dwelling, right? He will watch over. So and that means Moshe. right? So when God is, so to speak, is found in the place of his dwelling, which means like he's in the world, so to speak, he comes into our consciousness and he bears like the body of a human being, which means he's like seeing things through physical eyes and he's sort of relating through to our consciousness. That's called Moshe, right? In other words, the pasuk is referring to Hashem. He's talking about God, right? Hashem watches from his abode. But the Rosh Tevos of that is Moshe. Right? So when Hashem is watching from his abode, it means he's looking at things through our perspective, through the world. That's why he like relates to the world from the level of Klal Yisrael, as opposed to like this other kind of level of being, which is like, let's just erase Klal Yisrael. He's like sensitive to our needs. That's why, like, in other words, you go to the tzaddikim to ask for mercy and rachmin, so like to pray by their graves. Why? Just like pray to Hashem, because it's a concept of the Hashem found inside the tzaddikim. It's like the intermediary, basically, for us to have a more humanistic understanding to godliness. You follow that? So the arguments basically are, and all the kinds of different things that take place between their relationship is really that going on. Okay. Where were we? So we had a question after we got through saying that Rosh Hashanah is the revelation from above, and therefore it's available to you the higher level of fear and the intense level of bittul b'metzias, where you like go out of your existence completely and you're not really a you. In other words, you're not the you of the Nefesh Bahamas. You're like the you that God gives you. So we have a question. If that just happens on Rosh Hashanah, then why do we need to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Seemingly, the day of Rosh Hashanah itself should provide that for us. Rosh Hashanah comes. The king is in the palace. The revelation from above is happening. So we should just go into a state of bittul metzias. Who remembers the answer to this question? You weren't here. You have the answer? You read it on your own. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the very beginning, you said that will someone hear the shofar in the city and not be like terrified or whatever.
Okay.
So it says God in the city.
Interesting.
Not in the field.
Okay, that's good. But we use that pasuk to explain why we blow the shofar in Elul. We don't need to use that pasuk. There's a commandment, the Fedrus, to blow the shofar from the Torah in Rosh Hashanah. But it's good. We said, anyone else remember from the class who was here? We said that the reason is because Rosh Hashanah, despite the fact that it represents this gift from above and this revelation from above, it's still a day on the calendar. And a day on the calendar means it's associated with time and space, basically. In other words, the day before is not Rosh Hashanah, the day afterwards, is not Rosh Hashanah. So in other words, when you like all of a sudden have this gift from above into a place which is relevant to time. And since time itself is of the creation, time itself was elicited by Hashem for the sake of creation, then it's still in the boundaries of creation to a certain degree, and therefore from just something which is bound in nature, you still can't reach out of nature completely and get something which is totally beyond. We said to a certain degree, it definitely has a holiness like more than, let's say, the day before. So there is a certain aspect of revelation from above that comes just because of the day, right? However, it's not this level of bites. It's not this like intense makif that is completely beyond the world, because it still has a holding in the world due to the fact that it falls out on a certain day of the year. So therefore, in order to get the true power of the day, you have to blow the shofar. Why? Because the shofar is a mitzvah. And since the mitzvahs do not come from this world at all, right? The mitzvahs are, like we said, that a person from his own limited standing can only reach a certain level of God. If something doesn't come from above, to give him something from without outside of the world, then he can't just get there by himself. So therefore, Rosh Hashanah comes with its mitzvah of blowing the shofar, which enables the person essentially to reach this level of bittul, which is completely beyond the world, and therefore arrive at the level of bittul metzias, total self-nullity. And then basically we just got through saying that is another aspect of the bittul between Rosh Hashanah and Elul, is that the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah blowing the shofar is the mitzvah, whereas Elul, the shofar blowing, is not a mitzvah, right? So even though it creates a level of fear, because the shofar, as you mentioned, but nonetheless, since it's not a mitzvah that's associated with it, it doesn't give us a level of fear which like comes from beyond the realm of creation. It's a fear within the realm of creation, which is the lower level of fear, which can enable you to have bittul hayesh, but not like total self-nullity, basically. Alright, so that's where we left off. Nonetheless, this fear of Elul that you arrive at with the blowing of the shofar, which is not a mitzvah, it enables you to get to the higher level of fear. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek said originally. Why do we blow the shofar in Elul? Because we need the lower fear in order to reach the higher fear. Okay, let's go on. So, hey. What's that? You got it. Vehine Yedua. It's known. In order to come from the lower level of fear to the higher level of fear. Sorry, we said this also. Quick review. We said in order to come to the lower to the higher, you need something in between. You need love. Because the Seder is, as we mentioned before, fear, love, love, fear. We said we learned it from the Pasuk. Yitzchak ben Avram, Avram Halidas Yitzchak. We went through this, right? Avram is Yitzchak. It says in the Pasuk, Yitzchak, Avram, Avram, Yitzchak, which means basically fear, love, love, fear. And we said that if you look at it closely in the mimer and the mushal of the king in the field, you'll find in there all four of these levels. That's what you said? All four of these levels represents what's the first level of fear? The first level of fear is that the people have to go out to receive the king, right? Which means that there's an aspect that you have to do it yourself. You have to sort of create a level of Kabbalah's ol, which starts from you. We said fear comes from the person, love comes from above. So you start by going to the king in the field, and then it says the king receives you and shows you a beautiful face, or a smiling face. So this is two levels of love. He receives you with panim seven panim yafos, with a happy face, and then he shows you a smiling face. That's the lower level of love, the higher level of love. And then when you finally get to the palace of the king, and he's standing there and only the few individuals that are able to get in, that's the higher level of fear. So we said that in this mashal of the Alter Rebbe, he actually explained the whole process from beginning to end of how the Seder works. Okay. Now we're going to start today's class.
Rosh Hashanah is limited to time and space, like you said. But so is the month of Elul. It's also limited.
Okay, but that's not a problem because the month of Elul, anyway, is associated with the lower level of fear. So you're not anyway getting to these levels of Makif in the Elul. Vav. V'hine af shebadargos diyira. Even that in the realms of fear, Hayira de Elul, Hilamata Hayira de Rosh Hashanah. The fear of Elul, we said many, many times, is lower than the fear of Rosh Hashanah. Because it's only called Yira Tata, whereas Rosh Hashanah is Yira Ilah, the higher love, the higher fear. Mekom Makom, Yesh Maila ba Yira de Elul ala Yira de Rosh Hashanah. Okay, now we're kind of getting to the point. There is something much more advantageous to the fear of Elul than there is to the fear of Rosh Hashanah. Because the Yira and the Bittul of Rosh Hashanah, Kevan Sha'az Huzman Hizgalas Malchusi Yisbarach. Since, why does that fear come upon you? Because at that time, the king is in the palace. And there's a revelation of the glory of the king. Hayira Bittul Az Einam Chidush. Then the fear that you get at that time, should you merit it, is not a chiddush. It's nothing new. It's nothing fancy. You would expect it to be there, because there's a revelation of the king in all of his glory. So clearly, you're going to be blown away, and you're going to have fear. It's a higher level of fear than what you can get when the king is in the field, because the king isn't showing you his true self. But nonetheless, even though you experience something much, much higher and greater, on one hand, it's less significant because it's obvious. It's not a chiddush. There's no novelty to it. Of course, if someone's going to show you that, you're going to freak out and be afraid. Since everyone before him is as considered as naught, people who would be the great ministers, and when you'd see them in the street, you would fear, when they're standing before the king, they're nobody. Right? Someone pointed this out at the last Kinnis HaShluchim. Once a year, all the shluchim all over the world, they go and they gather together. They go to 770 and they have all kinds of conferences and so forth. And they were saying, they were walking by, and like, here goes this Rav of England, and here goes like the Rav of Sweden, here goes the Rav of, Tel Aviv, like people who in their own realms are like very important people who like inspire fear in their congregants and so forth. And in this place, they're just like, they're nobody. They're walking one past the other, like, pushing to get a siddur, saying, because when you're in the presence of the king, like everybody who is as naught, right? That's why there's a concept by Chassidim. They were not like, you don't really show that we don't, and people like don't like it actually. I remember this lady told me one time in England, she said she walked and she saw this young boy, and I'm not sure if I should share this story, but it's interesting. It shows a point. We can learn from it on both sides. But she saw this young boy, and like he greeted his Rebbe, his teacher in yeshiva in the street, and he like kissed his hand, and he was like, "Oh, Shalom Aleichem Rebbe." It was like this like tremendous sight, which is beautiful. But by Chassidim, you don't find that people are like mechabed the other one. They give them kavod. In other words, they love each other tremendously, maybe even more so. But you don't find that they emphasize the kavod of the other one, right? Even big rabbanim, like and their own congregants, there's definitely respect. There's not this level of like, because basically, and the Chassidim by each other, they don't like, because basically, when they come before the Rebbe, it's like they realize that they're not such a big deal, and the children realize their Rebbes aren't such a big deal. I mean, on a certain sense, it's lacking a little bit because you want to have that, you need to have a certain awe, which is also found to a certain degree, but it shows you that in front of this massive king, everybody is a little bit just flattened and equalized. Yeah. Which you don't find in other places, because the light of the intensity of the king, if it's not there, then all the different ministers and so forth, their importance is emphasized. Yeah.
No, it's interesting you said before, like when the king's in the palace, that's what makes him exalted.
Is that all the ministers are there, and all the people are there, and all the they're nobodies. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's what we're wondering.
What were you trying to say?
I was just saying that that it says like that the king without his people is like not really a king. So it's like interesting, like you put all the ministers together, and that's what makes him nothing.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
That was one of the great qualities of Moshe Rabbeinu. He was always from the king.
Right, exactly.
He was as great as he was. That's what made him so amazingly humble. He's always felt the presence of Hashem.
Yeah. The cave. That's just one of the reasons why it says we're supposed to appoint a king, is because this king should be always in front of the real king, and since not everybody else can be on such a level all the time, then he instills that fear of God in you when you see him. So if you're lacking that king figure, it's just like you and the Eibishter, lav dafka are you Moshe Rabbeinu to be standing for the king all the time. But when there's a man there, he's flesh and blood, he's standing before, and he's totally nullified to the king, it drives you to realize what's going on. Like we said before, the tzaddikim are sort of like a physical manifestation of the godly revelation. Alright, anyway, going on. So he said that since all who are before the king are as naught, v'koshu kameh yoser hu yoser kalo. It's an interesting phrase. Anyone who's closer to him is more as naught. In other words, you would think that it's the opposite way around. Like this is what we said. We gave a mashal about the regular person versus the regular chacham, wise man, versus the great chacham, like the Rebbe. Right? We said that the closer you are to the Rebbe, like if you're a chacham and you're so to speak close to the Rebbe, you even more realize your nothingness, because you realize that all this wisdom that you have and so forth is meaningless when you compare it to the wisdom of the real chacham. That things that you think is intelligence, by him it's not intelligent thought. It's like a thought of an animal. Whereas you're constructed all these wondrous theories. When you come by him, it's just like they're pale in comparison. So the closer you are to him, the more nullified you are. Whereas the simple person who comes to the Rebbe, he doesn't feel as nullified as the bigger person, because he'll say, "Ooh, look, this is a Rebbe. I'm going to become a Chassid." But on the contrary, when he looks where he came from, he says, these people are so crazy they never came along and like joined this great wise man. I'm great. I came into the picture. I'm in the Hasidic family over here. So he actually feels like a yesh, because he doesn't know anything anyway. So the further he is away from the king, even though he has a bittul, but it's not as strong of a bittul as the person who's closer, who really truly realizes that they're nothing. So when the king is out, basically, everybody's nothing, but the closer you are, the more nothing you are, which is interesting. In other words, you'd think that the higher ministers maintain some kind of a status, but they don't. The higher the minister is, the more he realizes that he's nothing. Because he thinks he had something, and now he knows he has nothing.
What is the British in Kuflin?
Kameh, before him.
That's the British version.
So now, going back to our story, this is the Jewish people are in a state of this high level of bittul. In the time of Rosh Hashanah, when they're found beheichel malchuso, in the palace, in the chamber of the king, ein b'zeh chiddush. Therefore, it's not really such a big deal. It's a big deal. It's actually a bigger deal than anything. But on the other hand, because it's natural and it comes to them in a way where there's no other choice, like you're standing before the king, you're obviously going to be in a state of nullity and fear. So it's not such a chiddush, it's not such a wondrous thing in that way. And he brings a whole example here, Al Pi Kabbalah. He says, for example, the bittul sheba Atzilus, the bittul that's found in the world of Atzilus. So there's 4 worlds. The world of Atzilus, like Bakoshi, we even call it a world. It's not even a world in the normal sense. That's why we usually say Atzilus and Biyah. We refer to the lower 3 worlds. We just say Bri, Tzir, Nasi, like in one foul swoop, because compared to Atzilus, they're all kind of the same. They're in their lowliness. Atzilus is its own thing. Why? Because the world of emanation. The world of emanation, as opposed to the world of creation, formation, and action, the world of emanation implies that it's still part of God. It's God emanating himself. As opposed to God creating something, and the creation of something entails that it's something other than him. So it's like it's a something besides him when he makes a creation. And then there's something besides him when he makes a creation, so it forms itself, and all kinds of things happen to the creation. But in Derech Klal, once you got to the level of Bria, you're already like something other than God. Whereas Atzilus, it's him. It's just him emanating himself. So obviously the sense of nullity before God, which is in the sense of in the place of Atzilus, is of a completely different nature than any type of nullity that you could possibly have in the world of Bria. Why? Because the world of Bria is defined in such a way that it experiences itself as exists. It says, I am a creation of you, God. There's 2 people there, right? And Hashem puts those boundaries on the Bria to make them feel separate. He doesn't take it away. So that whatever kind of level of bittul that you can come up with, you're always going to be nullifying yourself in a sense where you experience yourself as a separate being. Whereas in Atzilus, it's God himself. So obviously the bittul and the nullity before God there is of a completely different nature. We were just about to say that. It means since. B'kevan sheba Atzilus, since in Atzilus, Meir Gili Or Ein Sof, it shines the revelation of the Or Ein Sof. So obviously, the bittul there is extreme, and but on the other hand, it's not a chiddush. To be bittul there is an obvious thing. It's pshita. Of course, you're bittul there. It's God Himself. Like how can the world think itself to be something other than Him when the whole thing is just an emanation of Him?
Bittul is extreme.
The bittul there is extreme. Meir shines. V'al derek ze b'atzilus gufa, and if you want to take it a little bit further, in the world of Atzilus itself, which is already kulo bittul, in the world of Atzilus itself, the bittul of the sphere of Chokhmah, Shebahu ikra bittul, where that's the main source of bittul, eino chiddush. What enables there to be the world of Atzilus, basically, is that this thing called Chokhmah. Chokhmah is called koach ma. It means that there's this power which is a nullity before Hashem. Like it's kind of like Moshe Rabbeinu in many places is compared to Chachma. Why? Because even though he exists, his existence is merely a funnel to allow a higher existence to be seen through him. And once the higher existence is seen through him, like for example the Torah comes out, the Torah also is a nullity before Hashem. But the reason that there's able to be the Torah is because there's this there's this intermediary, this funnel, whose whole existence is to be a nullity. So the world of Atzilus, the whole of Atzilus is a nullity, because everything that flows out of this funnel is also just godliness. But nothing is quite as bittul as the funnel itself. It's like this existence of something whose whole existence is there to be nothing, and to allow something higher to come through it. That's what's called koach ma. It's a power of nothing. It's a power to be nothing, right? Nonetheless, it's a power, right? It's not mamish nothing. It's a power, but its function is that it does. It is nothing, right? That's what its function is, in not enabling something else to be there in its place. So in Atzilus itself, the power of Chokhmah is even a further state of bittul, and therefore also this is certainly not a chiddush. Since that's what Chokhmah's job is, to be bittul and to allow godliness to be seen through it, then it's no wonder that Chokhmah is a state of bittul. When you see the bittul of Chokhmah, you're on one hand amazed that there's such a level of bittul, but you're not amazed that Chokhmah is doing it, because that's what Chokhmah is supposed to do. It's no chiddush. Like, of course, since you're the point which joins godliness and enables it to come into the world, obviously you're standing in a state of total nullity, right? So it's not a chiddush. There's no novelty that there's a nullity there.
It's like novelty?
Yeah. The fish of a Chokhmah hu agiloi tuhu levad ve'ein zulasa, because Chokhmah represents what we call the revelation of he is alone and there's nothing besides him. In other words, the attitude that's found inside of the mind of Chokhmah is it's constantly saying to itself, all there is God and there's nothing else besides him. So obviously, it's in a state of nullity and it's not a chiddush. Uma kol shekein habittul de kesed. And that's just Chokhmah. He gets excited over here. He goes on and on. He said, and that. What about the bittul of Keser, which is also a sphere, but it's like above Atzilus? Even though it's a refined light, right? There's no like higher light than light of Keser. Nevertheless, it says in the Tikkuni Zohar, "Ukam hu kadam ilas ha'ilos." It's nevertheless considered black and dark before the cause of all causes. So even Keser, which is, we just got so excited about Chokhmah, it's beyond Chokhmah, and it's above the whole world of Atzilus Bichlal, so there's no light which is more clear and crisp than this. Nonetheless, it's called black in comparison to the cause of causes. What does that mean? Perush ukam husha keser hu bebittul. When it says it's black, it's referring to its state of nullity. Even though it's as strong, it's like the biggest minister you could be. It's ministering everything. All light starts there. Nonetheless, it's called black in compared to where it comes from. And why black is called bittul? He says, just like black, when you put it up against white, it looks like the black is sunk in. It doesn't protrude. Whereas in the contrary, if you take other colors and you put them on white, they look like they're higher than the white, right? It's like an optical illusion or something. Nonetheless, we could take meaning from this. The notion of black represents something like sunken in, which means it doesn't protrude its own existence to say like, here I am. It's a total nullity. So even though Keser is as high as lights come, it's called nothing. It's black before the cause of all causes. L'gabi Orein Sof shelamayla Keser, in relationship to the Orein Sof, which is above Keser. But nonetheless, ein zeh chiddush. The whole point we're trying to make out of all this is that you can't have more bittul than that. It's like the bittul ilah as you can be, but on the other hand, it's like no big deal. What would you expect Keser to be if it's sitting inside of the Orein Sof mamish and it hasn't before the worlds were created? Of course, it's in a state of total nullity. So again, even though it's the highest level of nullity you could find, on one hand it's like no big deal because of its place and its orientation. Because Keser recognizes that it is completely of no significance and is incomparable before the Orein Sof. However, right, the Yira and the Bittul of Elul, so that's what the Bittul and Yira of Rosh Hashanah is like, right? Of course you're Bittul, you're in front of the king, you're Keser. But the Yira and the Bittul of Elul, when the Melech hu besadeh, the king is now in the field, you don't see him in his palace, he's kind of just like slumming, he's in your neighborhood, right? And you therefore don't automatically feel his greatness and perceive his loftiness, because he's basically one of you. He's come to the street. And nonetheless, even though it's not coming at you, you run out and subdue yourself before him. That you receive the king as your king. The idea that you run out and take him is that you're nullifying yourself. You're saying, you are my king. And there's nothing forcing you, right, to say you're my king. You're not seeing his greatness. You're not forced into the state of bittul. So this is really a very much higher level. Not only are you running out to see the king, which we said in the beginning of the Maimer represents Kabbalah soul, but we said in addition to that you blow the shofar. And what's the idea of the shofar? We said is that it creates fear. And we said, we spent some time on this, but just to review, we said the difference between, what's that? To arouse. The difference between just having Kabbalah soul versus having fear is like two things which one does not require the second one. You could have fear and not Kabbalah soul. You can have Kabbalah soul and not fear. But the idea is when you want to have Kabbalah soul, when you want to receive like the yoke of heaven upon you and subdue yourself before the king, and you want it to be in a state of perfection, like it should be true in all of its in its fullness, then it also has to be done in a state of fear. You're not just like doing it because like, all right, I have to do it. I'm like forced it. I'm gonna do what I'm told. But you also mean it. You're like afraid, and you have like a palpable feeling of desire for this. There's fear attached to it. So that's why you blow the shofar. So we're saying that this idea of the bittul of Elul, which is not coming from because it's forced upon you. On the contrary, there's no revelation whatsoever. But you run out, and not only do you run out, but you're blowing the shofars to arouse your Kabbalah soul also to be in a state of perfection. You want to receive this king with the full gamut of your whole being. In order that your receiving of the king should be whole. So this level of bittul, af shu bittul hayesh, even though it's merely the lower level of bittul hayesh, which means that you haven't gone out of your existence completely, right? But you are still experiencing yourself, and you have your own decisions you can make, nothing's forcing you. Nevertheless, it's extremely precious in the eyes of God. Extremely precious in the eyes of God. Like it says, people who used to come before the Rebbe, I remember my father actually one time, he took this guy who was a total non-believer and a cynic and everything, and he was going through some hard times. He said, listen, you should go see the Lubavitch Rebbe. Like, I'm telling you, it's crazy. And he's like, this Rebbe, that Rebbe, you're not going to see a Rebbe, all of a sudden things are going to get better. He's like, just come. So basically, he took him, and this guy the whole way is just laughing and telling stories, like cracking up. He's like, look at this like zoo, these people think they're getting something spiritual out of this. The whole time, you're standing in line for hours. And he's just like, it's just having his way with it, and then you have like a second where you come for the Rebbe, he gives you $1, he looks at you and you go on, and he says for like the next 20 minutes, and the whole ride home back to Philadelphia, the guy was just like, kind of like, just quiet, somber, trembling, and he said, this is not like other Rebbes. He said, this is not just like another holy man. He said, this guy's the real thing. And like, which means what? When you come before the Heichel Malchuso, it's a different story. Like, of course you're going to be in a state of bittul. Of course you're going to be nullified. But to have a little sense, right? And to say, you know what? I'm not right now standing before the Rebbe. I guarantee you, if we were all right now standing before the Rebbe, we wouldn't be talking, we wouldn't be laughing, we wouldn't be doing anything. We'd be somber, trembling, and so forth. But to be in the same state of receiving his directives upon us, and to be just as given over as we would be, so to speak, if we were standing before him, in a certain sense, that's more precious to him. Because obviously if you're standing before him and he's looking at you, you're going to be nullified. But if you're not standing before him and you can go in the street and do whatever you want, and his image is engraved in your mind and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you're following the proper path because of his instruction, that is more precious to him than anything else. So that's what it says, that basically it's Yakar Be'eni Hashem, it says, it's precious in the eyes of God, this lower level of bittul, more than the higher level of bittul when you're standing in front of
without
him.
saying, it's just the choice.
It does go without
It's the
saying,
choice.
but until now
You don't
we
have a choice.
didn't say it.
Your husband all the way there.
That's right.
You have
And
a
since
choice.
it's based on your free will,
Right.
that's why Hashem made us, because He wants us to make the right
wants
decisions.
us to make it.
We don't have free will when we're standing in front of the revelations, like angels basically. He brings an interesting pasuk here, like in a footnote, but I think it's worthy to mention it, obviously. He brings a very interesting footnote. He says there's a pasuk. He says that it says that it's precious in the eyes of Hashem. We say in Hallel, Yaakov b'nei Hashem Hamsel Tzadikim, the Chassidim. It says that it's precious in the eyes of Hashem, the passing, the death of His righteous, of His Chassidim, right? And he brings over here, Yaakov b'nei Hashem is what the pasuk says. And what does it mean, Yaakov b'nei Hashem? It's precious in the eyes of Hashem. That's the phrase that the Rebbe uses when he says that this lower level of fear is precious in the eyes of Hashem. So then he quotes, why is he using that lashon? So he brings a footnote, not for no reason. He's quoting pasuk in Tehillim when it says it's precious in the eyes of Hashem very much. And the rest of the pasuk is the death of tzaddikim, the death of chassidim. Why? Who were like killed on Kiddush Hashem. So he says because basically this level of bittul. Here, let me find it. He says, Hamisa v'habittul. Death also can mean just like giving yourself over to die. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to die. Although previously we learned the Maimer on Chaf Av, the Yurtzeit of the Rebbe's father, like the advantage of actually giving your life versus just potentially being ready to give your life. Look there. But basically, the idea of the death of tzaddikim, whether it's a physical death or like the spiritual willingness to die, is a bittul that you make with your nefesh habahamis, right? In other words, you're coming to Hashem and giving yourself over. That's what it means, like to die in a state of kiddush Hashem, right? That's like you come to a test of your faith and you're like, kill me instead. I'm not going to lose my faith. That's yakar be'eni Hashem ma'od. It says, right? It's extremely precious to Hashem. And that's the same lashon he uses here, referring to this notion of nullifying yourself to the king when you're not in his presence. Okay, so going on, he says, "V'yesh loma, ta'al yidei ha'tainug shel hamelech mizeh," that through the pleasure, that the sheer pleasure that the king has from this. And by the way, it says, "Afkan omed ha'mashamesh." This is when Moshe Rabbeinu, went to his the pearly gates. It says that even then he was still standing, just like when he was here, he was standing here and serving us. Even when he was over there, so to speak, he doesn't stop being Moshe Rabbeinu because he goes over there. It's still the same Moshe Rabbeinu. By tzaddikim, death is not the same exact thing as it is for regular people. So it says that, and what I'm trying to say is that the going in the ways of the king of our generation still creates the same pleasure in his eyes as it did before. And through the pleasure, can you imagine that? Giving the king pleasure. The king, who is someone who's mamish, doesn't even know of your existence to a certain degree. Not know of it, but it's meaningless. Even the greatest wise man in the world, his meaning, his whole understanding and his greatness is as nothing before this person. Nonetheless, you're creating an inner tainug for this person. You are creating a deep and inner pleasure in this person. Imagine that. You not only do you matter and you take up place and he's considering your existence bichlal, but it's giving him pleasure and tainug. And you can do it, and specifically you can do it because you're so far away and you're not such a big deal. Because you're like a simple person, specifically that can give. And that's what it means, by the way, Ein Melech B'lo Am. You mentioned this pasuk, there's no king without a nation. The true concept of a king is specifically that there's simple people that are not recognizing necessarily what he is. And nonetheless, they're on board on the kingship. That's what makes the king really a king. Because the simple people who are distant from him and don't recognize him, they are also nullified to his greatness. So that's a greatness which is beyond. Because even they don't even realize who he is, they realize he's great.
So, based on the Rebbe saying that you can actually, a person can merit more from a little even.
That's right. Right? That through the pleasure that the king has, that you go out to greet him, right? In the field, which is again this lower level of fear, l'kabel panav, to receive the kingship. Bios or b'sadeh, while he's yet in the field and not revealing his glory, Yosin go out. Misvasef od yoser b'zeh, So you increase this notion that he's makabel as kulam masar panim yafus v'marei panim sochos to kulam. You sort of increase his reception of you in a pleasant face and his showing you a friendly face. In other words, you, by going out to him and showing this lower level of bittul, even though anyway, if you don't even go out, he's sitting there with a smiling face ready to greet you. When you go out and you show him that you're like nullified to his will, even though you're not in the world of Atzilus and you're not Chochmah and you're not Keser, you amplify his smiling face. You generate more love and tainug from the king. V'yesh lahosif, and this is a major point here. We're going to end with this. The real greatness of this fear and nullity in Elul over and above that of Rosh Hashanah is not only in this thing we've been describing for a half an hour, that it's a chiddush, right? That it's a novelty. That of course you're going to be nullified in Atzilus, but the fact that you come and nullify yourself in Bria, Yitzira, and even in Asiya, and you're going to come before him, that's mamash a chiddush. He says, besides that, there's also a preciousness in the inyan habittul, right? In the concept of the bittul itself, not just that it's more of a novelty, but in the quality of what the bittul is. Because before we were saying the quality of the higher bittul is higher, it's just not as much of a novelty. But now we're saying even the quality of the lower bittul is even higher to a certain degree. Why? Because if you're nullified due to a revelation that happens to you, since the revelation comes about, because you recognize and feel the highness and the wonders of the revelation that's before you, you realize that what's in front of me is totally incomparable to me and I'm like nothing before it, then the bittul is connected with yourself. It's a very deep thing. Even though we don't have time to properly enter into it, but before we were saying that the lower level of fear is connected with bittul hayesh. There's a sense of self there, right? And the higher level of fear, you can get to a place where there's no self. Yeah? Now we're going to flip it on its head and say the exact opposite is true. The higher level of fear, like this chacham who recognizes the great chacham, we said on one hand he can go completely out of himself. Whereas the lower guy, the simple man, he never goes completely out of himself, because on the contrary, when he becomes bittul to the king, he just sort of feels good about himself. Okay, that's true, and we said that. But now we're going to flip it on its head. The guy who's closer to being a chacham, why does he nullify himself before the king? Because he recognizes that he's a chacham. Because he has an appreciation for just how great this person is. Therefore, he feels himself to be a self-nullity. So what happens here? It's because of his recognition, because he feels that he's in front of such a revelation, that he nullifies himself. So therefore, his bittul is all caught up with himself. Right? It's only because he feels it that this person is of the revelation of this person. And then he's aware of it, and he has like a certain sense of himself in that he is willing to be given over. So it's bound up in him, in his own identity, his recognition. Where the real concept of bittul is an avoda of kabbalas ol. When you're like a slave, that you don't recognize what's great about the person before you. The slave isn't like, wow, my master has this quality and this quality, so good. He's worthy to be a slave of him. He's such a simple person. He doesn't know at all who this person is. And nonetheless, he's totally given over to him. Because of the mere yoke that he put on of the master, that he put on himself, he's forced to fulfill the will of the master. So therefore, his bittul is only because he's giving up his identity. It's not because he recognizes and he's holding on to his identity, and by this nature of his identity, he forces him, he's like, of course he's going to be given over because it's natural to him, it makes sense, he understands it. This one who's a slave, he doesn't understand who this person is at all. So the fact that nonetheless he's able to be nullified to him is because he has an awesome sense of nullity and bittul, that despite the fact he has no recognition of what he's nullifying himself to, he puts on the yoke and digs in the ground and does what he's supposed to do. So actually even the quality of bittul, of Elul, is higher specifically because there is no revelation. Okay.
What's the last verse that you say,